Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is staring at a phone, experiencing a silent psychological crisis. They are trapped in a loop they engineered, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming realization that they desperately love the exact person they discarded 3 months ago. We've been taught a massive lie about human behavior. We are told that when an avoidant attachment style walks away, rejects you, or goes cold, it's because they don't care. We've been conditioned to believe their silence is indifference, and that their exit is final. But if you look at human beings through the lens of behavioral mechanics and hidden psychological architecture, you start to see a very different, almost terrifying truth. The rejection wasn't the end of the story. It was the necessary first trigger in a massive subconscious chain reaction. In the next few minutes, we are going to dissect the hidden mechanics of a specific high-stakes behavioral phenomenon. Why an avoidant invariably falls deeply, obsessively in love with the empath they once rejected. If you have ever been left stranded by someone who suddenly pulled away just when things were getting deep, you need to understand something right now. Your empathy wasn't a weakness that drove them away. It was a high-yield psychological mirror that their nervous system wasn't equipped to handle. But mirrors don't disappear just because you close your eyes. This isn't about pop psychology, and we aren't here to give you cheap comfort. We are going to map out the exact timeline of the avoidance mind, from the moment they trigger the rejection, through the illusion of their relief, straight to the exact breaking point where their brain completely flips the valuation of you. You will discover the precise behavioral shift that occurs when an empath stops chasing, and how that sudden vacuum forces an avoidant's suppressed emotional wave to crash back over them with double the intensity. If you leave this video early, you will likely remain stuck in the trap of feeling inadequate, interpreting their coldness as your failure. But if you watch this all the way through to the final sequence, you will understand the hidden operational loops of attachment security, the exact science behind why their brain converts past fear into present obsession, and exactly how the human nervous system processes the agonizing contrast of a lost, genuine connection. Let's look at the data. When a person with an avoidant attachment style encounters a genuine empath, a collision of two completely different psychological architectures occurs. The empath operates with high emotional acuity. They see behind the mask, they read the micro-expressions, and they naturally extend a deep, resonant vulnerability. To a regulated nervous system, this feels like coming home. To an avoidant, it feels like a tactical breach of their perimeter. The avoidant doesn't run away because the empath is flawed. They run because the empath's proximity forces a subconscious threat assessment. The avoidance brain translates intimacy as a vulnerability that will inevitably lead to subjugation or pain. So they deploy their primary defense mechanism, deactivation. They find a flaw, they rationalize an exit, and they execute a rejection. In that moment, they believe they have won their freedom back. They feel a sense of relief, a spike of autonomy, and they mistake this emotional numbness for absolute control. Following the rejection, the avoidant enters what behavioral analysis identifies as the phase of phantom independence. During this period, which can last weeks or even months, their psychological profile shows high levels of self-reassurance. They tell themselves the empath was too needy, too intense, or unstable. But let's look at the underlying mechanics. This relief is entirely dependent on a single variable, the assumption that the empath is still out there, wanting them. As long as the avoidant feels the invisible thread of the empath's longing, their ego feels secure. They have the luxury of distance without the reality of abandonment. They are operating on a false baseline. The entire system shatters the moment the empath undergoes a psychological upgrade. When the empath stops sending the energy, stops checking the profile, and completely closes the energetic loop, the behavioral metrics shift overnight. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer in safe isolation. They are in absolute isolation. The brain processes social rejection and the permanent loss of a high-value attachment figure in the same regions that register physical pain. Without the empath's warmth operating as a background safety net, the avoidance subconscious realizes it is completely exposed to the cold. This is where the valuation flip occurs. In human behavioral engineering, we know that perceived scarcity instantly spikes the value of an asset. The empath, who was once classified by the avoidance defenses as a threat to autonomy, is suddenly reclassified by the subconscious as a scarce, life-saving resource. The avoidant may attempt to replace the empath with low-acuity connections, people who don't demand depth, who stay on the surface, who don't require the mask to come off. But this triggers the contrast effect. Every shallow interaction, every superficial conversation, and every empty silence only highlights the profound, electrifying depth of what they had with the empath. They realize that while other people validate their mask, only the empath truly saw their soul. The human brain cannot suppress an emotional wave indefinitely. The avoidant spent months pushing down the grief, the attraction, and the bond. But suppression only compresses the psychological spring. When the spring releases, it doesn't return to zero. It violently snaps forward. This is the moment of total capitulation. The avoidant falls in love not despite the rejection, but because the rejection failed to break the empath, and instead broke the illusion of the avoidant's self-sufficiency. They become consumed by the memory of the safety they threw away. They realize that the empath was the only person capable of navigating their minefield without detonating it. They are forced to confront a brutal psychological truth. They didn't protect themselves from a threat. They locked themselves out of their own sanctuary. And now, driven by the intense, delayed realization of what they've lost, the avoidant is ready to do the one thing they swore they would never do: risk everything to claw their way back to the person they once pushed away. When a person with an avoidant attachment style encounters a genuine empath, they are not entering a standard romantic negotiation. They are stepping into a high-stakes collision of two completely incompatible psychological architectures. To understand why an avoidant ultimately falls in love with the person they discarded, we must first dissect the precise behavioral metrics of the initial rejection. The common narrative in pop psychology is that the avoidant simply loses interest, finds a flaw, or realizes there is no chemistry. This is a fundamental misreading of human behavioral mechanics. The avoidant does not reject the empath because of a lack of attraction, a lack of compatibility, or a deficit in the empath's value. They reject the empath because the empath operates as a highly acute, flawless psychological mirror. The empath possesses an innate ability to read microexpressions, decode vocal shifts, and see directly through the defensive armor that the avoidant has spent a lifetime constructing. This level of emotional transparency is something an avoidance nervous system is fundamentally unequipped to handle. When the empath extends genuine, deep vulnerability and invites the avoidant into a space of absolute intimacy, a profound threat assessment is instantly triggered within the avoidant's subconscious mind. To a secure, regulated individual, this depth feels like safety, connection, and coming home. But to the distorted wiring of an avoidant attachment style, intimacy is directly mapped to danger, engulfment, and an inevitable loss of autonomy. The closer the empath gets, the more the avoidant's internal security system flags the situation as a tactical breach of their perimeter. They begin to experience a state of somatic hyperarousal. Their heart rate shifts, their stress response activates, and their subconscious demands immediate relief from the suffocating pressure of being truly seen. To survive this perceived threat, the avoidant deploys their primary defensive software: deactivation. This is a cognitive and emotional shutdown designed to sever the connection before the other person can cause them harm. However, because the human mind requires logical consistency to justify its emotional reactions, the avoidant cannot simply admit to themselves that they are terrified of love. Instead, their brain immediately begins to scan the empath for flaws, magnifying microscopic imperfections into monumental deal breakers. They rationalize the exit, convincing themselves that the empath is too needy, too dramatic, too emotional, or simply not the right fit. When they execute the rejection, walking away with a cold, calculated detachment, it looks to the outside world like absolute indifference. But this indifference is a carefully manufactured illusion. The rejection is not an expression of true closure. It is a defensive maneuver executed to lower the agonizingly high volume of their own attachment anxiety. In the immediate aftermath of the discard, the avoidant experiences a massive surge of relief, misinterpreting this sudden numbness as personal empowerment and absolute freedom. They believe they have successfully mitigated the threat and reclaimed their independence. What they fail to realize is that this entire sequence has established a false baseline. By running away from the mirror, they have not resolved their core trauma. They have merely delayed the psychological debt. The baseline is entirely artificial because it relies on the absolute suppression of the attachment bond they just formed. They have engineered a temporary emotional vacuum, unaware that the very depth, safety, and acute emotional resonance they just fled from has now been permanently registered by their subconscious mind as the highest yield connection they have ever experienced. Following the execution of the rejection, the avoidant enters a highly distinct behavioral phase that profiling categorizes as phantom independence. To the outside observer, and certainly to the devastated empath, the avoidant appears entirely unaffected, moving forward with an almost chilling level of normalcy. They may throw themselves into their career, increase their social calendar, or even enter casual, low-stakes romantic dynamics. Within their internal psychological architecture, a massive artificial surge of autonomy is taking place. The avoidance brain interprets the sudden absence of intimacy not as a profound loss, but as a hard-won victory for their personal survival. They experience a chemical relief, a drop in nervous system hyperarousal, and they misinterpret this temporary emotional numbness as genuine healing and absolute self-sufficiency. They tell themselves a highly structured, self-reassuring narrative that they are simply stronger alone, that they dodged a bullet, and that the empath's emotional world was a chaotic ecosystem they are fortunate to have escaped. However, if we audit the behavioral mechanics of this phase, we find that this entire state of independence is a psychological illusion. It is a house of cards built on a single invisible variable that the avoidant is entirely unaware of: the assumed availability of the empath. The avoidance ego is currently operating on an unearned credit line. Even though they have severed physical contact and pushed the empath away, their subconscious mind is still actively relying on the energetic background radiation of the empath's longing. They can feel, on a subconscious level, the invisible thread of the empath's grief, the empath's unspent love, and the empath's desperate desire for closure or reconciliation. This creates a highly toxic psychological luxury for the avoidant. They get to enjoy the absolute freedom of distance, completely unburdened by the demands of a relationship, while simultaneously retaining the deep, subconscious security of knowing that they are still fundamentally wanted, desired, and validated by a high-value individual. This phantom independence is essentially an emotional buffer zone. The avoidant has placed a massive distance between themselves and the emotional trigger, but they have not actually processed the separation. Because their defense mechanisms are dialed up to maximum capacity, their brain is actively filtering out any data that contradicts their narrative of relief. They look at their own life and see stability, completely blind to the fact that this stability is entirely subsidized by the empath's ongoing emotional investment. They are living on borrowed time, operating on a countdown clock that they cannot see. The relief they feel is not a permanent state of being. It is merely the quiet space that exists before a major psychological shift. They have decoupled from the empath physically, But because the empath's emotional anchor is still theoretically dropped in their harbor, the avoidant does not yet have to face the terrifying reality of true, absolute abandonment. They believe they have successfully mastered the art of walking away, completely unaware that their entire sense of power and control during this phase is entirely dependent on the empath remaining stuck in the trap of waiting for them to return. The entire psychological house of cards collapses the exact moment the empath undergoes a profound internal upgrade and completely withdraws their energy. In behavioral analysis, we track the precise moment the target ceases the chase, stops checking the profiles, and mentally closes the loop. When the empath finally accepts the reality of the rejection and genuinely detaches, a massive structural shift occurs in the avoidant's subconscious architecture. Suddenly, the unearned credit line the avoidant was operating on is abruptly canceled. They are no longer existing in a state of safe isolation. They have been dropped into the cold reality of absolute abandonment. The invisible background radiation of the empath's longing, which had been silently subsidizing the avoidant's ego and fueling their phantom independence, vanishes overnight. This creates an immediate, severe psychological vacuum within the avoidant's nervous system, forcing an instantaneous and violent valuation flip. In human behavioral engineering, the metrics of value are heavily governed by the law of perceived scarcity. When an asset is readily available, or assumed to be waiting on the sidelines, its perceived value drops significantly. This is why the avoidant was initially able to classify the empath's deep love as cheap, suffocating, or readily disposable. But when that love is entirely removed from the equation, when the empath's warmth is completely offline and replaced by a stark, unyielding wall of indifference, the brain's threat assessment software shifts its parameters. The avoidant's subconscious instantly reclassifies the empath. They are no longer viewed as a threat to personal freedom. They are suddenly perceived as an incredibly scarce, high-value, and life-saving resource that has been catastrophically lost. The brain processes social rejection and the permanent deletion of a secure attachment figure in the exact same neural pathways that register physical pain and survival deprivation. As this vacuum deepens, the narrative the avoidant constructed to justify the rejection begins to completely disintegrate. The flaws they magnified to execute their exit suddenly look incredibly trivial, while the profound emotional safety and high-yield connection the empath provided are magnified to an agonizing degree. The avoidant enters a state of cognitive dissonance, where their conscious mind is desperately trying to maintain the illusion of their independence, while their subconscious is screaming at them that they have made a fatal operational error. They realize, with terrifying clarity, that they did not successfully protect their autonomy. They merely exiled themselves from the only sanctuary they had. Every cold shoulder they previously gave now backfires, converting into a deep, hollow ache within their own chest. Without the empath's emotional anchor operating as their silent safety net, the avoidant is forced to look at the vast, empty expanse of their own internal landscape, realizing for the first time that the power they thought they held during the breakup was completely dependent on the very person they discarded. Once the valuation flip has occurred and the psychological vacuum deepens, the avoidant invariably attempts to stabilize their crashing system by seeking out replacement connections. In behavioral science, we call the resulting phenomenon the contrast effect. The avoidant will consciously choose individuals who operate on a much lower level of emotional acuity than the empath, people who are comfortable staying entirely on the surface, who do not demand deep vulnerability, and who allow the avoidant to keep their defensive mask firmly locked in place. On paper, this is exactly what the avoidant's fears demanded: a low-stakes relationship that requires zero emotional risk. However, this strategic pivot backfires catastrophically when processed through the mechanics of human memory and emotional resonance. Every single superficial interaction, every hollow, script-like conversation, and every empty silence shared with these new partners serves as a brutal, high-definition contrast to the electrifying, soulful depth they experienced with the empath. They quickly discover that while these new individuals successfully validate their external mask, they are utterly incapable of seeing, reaching, or soothing the raw psychological architecture beneath it. This stark behavioral contrast triggers a massive failure in the avoidance primary defensive software: emotional suppression. For weeks or months, the avoidants successfully compress their genuine attraction, their grief, and their attachment to the empath, burying it beneath a mountain of rationalizations and distractions. But human behavioral engineering proves that emotional suppression operates exactly like a mechanical spring. You can apply immense force to compress it, and it will hold its shape temporarily, giving the illusion that the energy has been neutralized. However, the energy is not gone. It is merely being stored as hyper-concentrated potential energy. The longer and harder the spring is compressed, the more violent the eventual release will be. As the contrast effect continually highlights the barren, hollow nature of their current life, the avoidant's conscious grip on that psychological spring begins to slip. The defense mechanisms simply run out of fuel. When that mechanical spring finally snaps, the suppressed emotional wave does not return gently to a baseline. It rushes forward with double the velocity and absolute destructive intensity. The avoidance nervous system is suddenly flooded with a delayed, agonizing wave of grief, regret, and intense longing that they can no longer compartmentalize or intellectualize away. The numbness they relied on to survive the aftermath of the breakup completely evaporates, leaving them entirely exposed to the raw weight of the bond they tried to destroy. Their brain is flooded with a neurochemical deficit, a sudden drop in dopamine and oxytocin that can only be corrected by the specific emotional signature of the person they pushed away. They find themselves trapped in a state of hyperfixation, where every song, every location, and every internal thought loops back to the empath. They are forced to confront the terrifying reality that the emotional depth they once classified as a dangerous threat was actually the only substance capable of truly nourishing their profoundly starved internal landscape. This flood of suppressed emotion leads directly to the final, most volatile stage of the avoidance psychological arc: total capitulation and the onset of genuine obsession. In behavioral engineering, we understand that a human being falls in love not during the moments of comfortable connection, but during the moments of profound, agonizing absence. The avoidant does not fall in love with the empath despite the rejection. They fall in love because the rejection failed to shatter the empath's value, and instead completely shattered the avoidant's illusion of self-sufficiency. As the full force of the delayed emotional wave hits their conscious awareness, their entire psychological architecture undergoes a radical realignment. The defensive armor they wore as a badge of honor for months is suddenly viewed as a self-inflicted prison. They are forced to look at the cold, clinical reality of what they have done. They did not protect their freedom from an intrusive threat. They successfully exiled themselves from the only genuine sanctuary they have ever known. This realization shifts their behavioral baseline from passive regret to active, consuming fixation. The avoidance brain, desperately seeking to resolve the severe neurochemical deficit caused by the empath's absolute withdrawal, enters a state of hyper-focused simulation. They replay past interactions on an endless loop, analyzing every micro-expression, every conversation, and every moment of shared intimacy with a level of scrutiny they were completely incapable of exercising when they were actually present in the relationship. They become profoundly aware that the empath was the only individual possessing the high emotional acuity required to navigate their internal minefield without detonating it. The very traits they previously weaponized as reasons to leave, the empath's depth, their sensitivity, their refusal to accept a superficial connection, are now viewed as the ultimate markers of an irreplaceable elite partner. The avoidant is trapped in a profound state of cognitive capitulation, where their ego has lost all authority and their primitive attachment system has taken complete control of the wheel. Driven by this intense, delayed realization of loss, the avoidance behavior transforms from defensive evasion into a highly calculated strategy for reclamation. The fear of vulnerability, which previously dictated their every move, is entirely eclipsed by a far more terrifying fear: the reality of permanent erasure from the empath's life. They monitor the empath's silence, interpreting it no longer as peace, but as a ticking clock, marking the final expiration of their chance to return. They begin to engineer scenarios for contact, drafting messages, checking for any microscopic vulnerability in the empath's boundary, and looking for a tactical entry point to re-establish connection. They are now entirely willing to risk the very exposure they once fled from, ready to throw themselves back into the fire of intimacy, just to escape the absolute freezing cold of the vacuum they created. They have become completely obsessed with reclaiming the safety they carelessly discarded, fully prepared to dismantle their own psychological defenses in a desperate bid to win back the only person who truly saw through them.